Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Nikki Ivy with Sweetfish Media. Guys, I've got with me today Aashish Dhamdere, who is Vice President of Marketing at Skilljar. Aashish, how you doing today?
Nikki, thanks for having me. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited. Guys, we're going to be talking about how education drives growth, and that's both company growth and career growth. So I'm excited to really dig in. But before we get into all of that, Aashish, I'd love it if you would just give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you and the folks at Skilljar have been up to these days.
Fantastic. Yes. So I run marketing here at Skilljar, and Skilljar is the leading customer training platform. And what we do is help companies accelerate product adoption and increase retention. We work with companies like Tableau, Zendesk, Smartsheet, Cisco, and we help them deliver just beautiful customer experiences that are backed by data. Essentially, we give you all the tools that you need for customer training and enablement, and you can use those to onboard, engage, and retain your customers. So that's a little bit about Skilljar. We're based in Seattle, and I'm excited to have the conversation today.
Yes, me too. I haven't had anybody that does exactly what you guys do on the show yet. So thanks for laying that out for us. I think it's great to be bringing something a little fresh to our listeners. And freshness in, like I said, like you mentioned, this idea of education and what you guys do is a little bit different that we're going to be talking about today. But there is a common thread, which is this idea that education drives growth. So give us a quick overview of what compelled you to write the piece that you wrote about this a while back and why you think this is so important.
Absolutely. In general, what I find is when you work at a startup, it's just a very fertile environment for you to grow your career. And a key driver of that is curiosity. If you're curious, that drives learning and that drives growth. A lot of growth in any company, it doesn't really matter how big the company is, happens in the cracks between departments. So this is where you don't really know who owns it. It could be owned by sales, by marketing, and by customer success. And if you find opportunities like that, you can shape your own role. You can shape the growth of the company. And that obviously drives growth of both the company and the individual. So I've been doing a lot of thinking on how best to do it. And a few things come to mind. Skilljar is my fifth startup. So I've had the opportunity to observe what's worked for other people, what's worked for me, and identify some patterns that I'll speak to here. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but these are just probably my top 3 or 4 observations. I'd say the number one thing you should always try to learn about is your customer. And this comes down to who are they, right? So this is personas. What type of companies are they in? What roles, what titles, but also what are the problems that they're trying to solve? And here, there's a particular framework that was developed by Clayton Christensen. You've probably heard of The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a really popular book that he wrote. There's an article that he wrote on this framework. It's really popular with product folks, and it's worth learning. Every marketer should get a good sense for it because it gives you an understanding of the problems that people are trying to solve. That also then leads into the emotional landscape for your customers. Empathy is a marketing superpower. And I think you can think about human beings as fundamentally emotional beings that are really good at giving rational, logical answers for why they made a decision. But actually, what's driving the decision is a lot of emotions. And this is both positive emotions and negative emotions. So just having a sense for that landscape can be very powerful. This helps you figure out how you can uniquely help a customer, and also what the stories that people are telling themselves. Every human being has sort of navigates their life with stories. We're each on a hero's journey of some sorts. So if you can get a sense for that for the prospect, you are functioning at a level that most companies are just not functioning at. And learning about that is super important. Some elements that help you learn that are obviously psychology and behavioral economics, because there's a big difference in this view of customers or human beings as being purely rational beings. Reality tends to be a lot messier. We're not always rational. So the more you can learn about that, the more you can apply it in marketing. Daniel Kahneman has a fantastic book called Thinking Fast and Slow, right, which gets into this. Richard Thaler has a really good book called Nudge that gets into this. There are any number of really good blog posts and blogs out there. Farnham Street, which is this blog that's based in Canada, is one of my favorites. And they have a podcast that's really good too. So just some recommendations. A couple other things quickly. Marketing technology. If you're in marketing, there's been this Cambrian explosion of technology that you can use to learn about your prospects and customers, reach out to them, engage with them. And you have to keep your finger on the pulse of this. You have to keep tracking what's going on. And then lastly, I would say all of this is, I wouldn't say useless, but it's not applied in the best way possible if you don't learn how to manage the self. And there's a great Peter Drucker article about this in Harvard Business Review. But really, this is about the mental game. This is about having clarity of thought. It's about being aware of your own mental biases. It's about understanding environments where you perform at your best, where you're in flow, and environments where you don't, and understanding, picking the right spots and figuring out if you can hack the environment, and also not letting the ego getting in the way of doing the right thing for the team and the business. This is obviously, it's a journey. There's no perfection here. I think it's the practice of learning to manage the self. A combination of these things, it served me well. I've seen it serve other people well as well. And so I think every marketer, every listener of your podcast should start thinking about what's their journey, what do they want to learn, and then map out how they would go about it.
I love that. Yeah, you gave us a lot. So if you are big picture, the things that it's helpful or that necessary to focus on in terms of what to educate yourself on to drive your career growth is you need to educate yourself on who it is that you're talking to in terms of your customers. You need to educate yourself on the emotional landscape within that industry or within those folks that you're going to be talking to every day. What are they up against? And you mentioned, what stories are they telling? So far there's a lot of listening involved in this education process that drives growth. And I noticed not a lot of really anything else, right? Not a lot that has to do with you until we get to this part where you need to learn about yourself. And I think a lot of the time that's the part that gets left off. When I think of how salespeople in particular are onboarded, and it's likely the same way with marketers, right? A lot of your training, yes, you're going to get trained on what the personas are, and you're going to get, trained on what the problem is that your product attempts to solve. But there isn't necessarily training at the organizational level anyway, a lot of the time about, the value of knowing yourself. So that's going to have to be something that you do on your own. And I think it's easy to forget about that or lose sight of that when you're, putting a lot of your energy in on educating yourself on these other, parts of the pieces of the puzzle. So I like the way that you laid that out. So that's the sort of framework / formula for things to educate yourself on when it comes to when you're pursuing career growth. Talk about what that looks like when you apply it to a company, to the goal of company growth.
Yeah, I think that's a great pivot. And by the way, you're so right. on this idea of educating the self or the journey within. Schools don't necessarily talk about it. It's not a part of any formal education curriculum. But if you study philosophy, if you study religion, if you study any of that, you'll notice that all the greats have talked about this. They've said the journey within is what really leads you to drive change outside. So I couldn't agree with you more on the importance of doing that. And I wish there were more formalized options out there. But I think that's a separate topic. We can come back to that at some point in the future. In terms of learning driving growth, I hinted at some of this in my earlier question, but in general, most startups tend to be really product focused. And that's good. It's a good thing in many, many cases. But for marketers, you have to be really intentional and mindful in understanding prospect needs. And a good way to think about this is every company will tell you they're customer obsessed, that they're customer focused. But you really have to listen carefully to what they're saying. And then you have to look at how their actions, how that thought is getting translated into actions. Many companies will think of their customers as essentially big dollar signs, as our CEO likes to say. And that's an incomplete picture. That's oftentimes a byproduct of you really understanding the problems that they're trying to solve and what they're trying to do better, and then what they would like to learn. And most companies have a ton of intellectual property on these problems that can be solved. And I like to think of this as the discipline as opposed to just the product. It's the product plus the solution story. So if you can create a learning program where people can come in and learn how to do something new or solve problems that they have currently, it can be very powerful. I have some examples of this. These happen to be our customers, but I think there's a ton of people doing good work on this. MapOut is a company, as an example, that does big data education. So you can go in and learn all these tools. They're now a part of HPE, I think, and you can get trained on it. There's a company called Trade Desk that does training for ad tech, where you can go in and learn these new ad tech technologies. Smashfly is a company that does it for HR technology. Procore is a company that does it for construction technology. Snowflake, which is this white hot unicorn, does it for how you do data warehousing in the cloud. Essentially what you're doing is training a cohort of people on how they can solve problems and build their own careers. And if you do this right, obviously you get leads because these people are coming in and registering on your website to get this training. But what you're also doing is creating these evangelists where they will take your product from company to company as they go on. And you end up creating this sort of setup to be the default option when people are trying to solve this problem. So it can be a very powerful investment to make. And a lot of times it doesn't take a lot of investment on your side because you already have onboarding resources that you've developed. Your customer success team can probably come in and help you deliver a lot of this content. You can record it and provide it in an on-demand fashion. So we've seen this over and over again, can be a really powerful long-term investment that marketing can drive in partnership with customer success or product, and therefore drive company growth with it.
Hey everybody, Logan with Sweetfish here. You probably already know that we think you should start a podcast if you haven't already. But what if you have and you're asking these kinds of questions? How much has our podcast impacted revenue this year? How's our sales team actually leveraging the podcast content? If you can't answer these questions, you're actually not alone. This is why Casted created the very first content marketing platform made specifically for B2B podcasting. Now you can more easily search and share your audio content while getting greater visibility into the impact of your podcast. The marketing teams at Drift, Terminus, and here at Sweetfish have started using Casted to get more value out of our podcasts, and you probably can too. You can check out the product in action at casted.us/growth. That's casted.us/growth. All right, let's get back to the show.
For sure. It's, just this idea of elevating the industry, making a contribution, building a community around what you do that, involves your product, but doesn't center on it. So it's how you answer the question, how is customer focus or customer experience or customer obsession, as you put it, how is that enacted? Right? Versus,
that's exactly right.
Right. You talked about people feel that way, or that's part of their philosophy, but where is the action behind it? And that's where it is. It is in building that community like you talked about, and, making those resources available to folks, really accessible to folks who, whether you're a customer or not, but just, proving not just that this industry, but that you're a member of it, you care about it, you're involved in pushing things forward for everyone. I love that. And it starts with education. You got to know these things in order to teach them. You've got to place a high premium and a high value on the education to begin with, in order to justify making the kinds of investments in it that you're talking about. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. These little insights into how exactly does education drive growth when it comes to a career, and how does it drive growth when it comes to a company. I think you gave us some really good examples. And, before I get to this next segment, I want to ask you, is there anything else that, with respect to education driving growth, whether it's career or company, that you want to leave our listeners with before we move on?
Yeah, I would say you encapsulated that beautifully. The prospects, customers tend to buy your why a lot sooner than before they buy the what and the how. That comes later. And if you start with this philosophy of giving and of making people successful, you'd be surprised at how much faster deals progress and how much people buy into sort of what you're doing if you start from a place of giving. So I think that's a good place to be.
I love it. So Aashish, now that I have successfully picked your brain and seen what I could get out of it, it is time for you to tell us a little bit about what you're putting in it. So let us know about, a learning resource or something that you're engaging with that's just, informing your approach or got you excited these days.
Yes, I have a book recommendation. I love reading, and I'm an engineer, so I'm always looking for books that go beyond just the logical, because I've gotten trained on the logical for a bit.
Sure.
And there's a book called Alchemy that's by a gent by the name of Rory Sutherland. He runs Ogilvy Mathers, which is this massive global ad agency. He's based in the UK, but the book is called Alchemy, and he walks you through the different approaches to sort of non-logical marketing, I will call it. And just one snippet from it that stuck with me for the last couple of weeks is a lot of times the opposite of a good idea is not a bad idea, but another good idea. And it's this sort of parallel thinking approach that a lot of us struggle with. Engineers in particular can often be very dualistic. It's either good or bad. Mm-hmm. And reading this book has opened up some new creative things for me to try. Rory's he's an ad legend, so he walks you through the development of campaigns. He talks about how seemingly non-logical choices can have a massive impact. He talks about ad testing. I think your listeners would enjoy reading the book and walk away with some fresh insights from it.
I love it. I want to read this book. Thank you. A lot of the times folks will name books that either I have read or that are currently sitting in my Audible library. But this is one I hadn't heard of yet. So thank you for that. Listen, Aashish, I know that just like me, everybody listening has become a fast fan of yours, and they are going to want to know how to keep up with you. So tell us how folks can connect with you.
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. I'm also on Twitter at just my last name. So it's at Dhamdhere. Look me up there. Let me know if you have a book recommendation. I'm always curious to know if there's a book I should read or a podcast that you enjoy. I'd love connecting with you.
Thanks so much. We'll have to have you on again. There were a couple of questions that came up that we both, I think, wanted to dig into. But as you said, that's a whole other episode. So
I'd love
until then, thanks so much, Aashish.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks again for having me.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.